The year was 1932, and Charles Lindbergh was more than just a pilot. He was a living legend. 5 years earlier, he had made history by flying solo across the Atlantic, a feat that turned him into a global hero. The Lindberghs were admired, envied, and idolized. Their New Jersey home symbolized safety, success, and the American dream. But on the cold evening of March 1st, 1932, everything shattered. In the nursery of the Lindbergh home, 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr., the couple's first child, lay asleep. By 10 p.m., when the nurse went to check on the baby, the crib was empty. The window was open. A crudely built wooden ladder leaned against the wall. And on the windowsill, a ransom note demanding $50,000. The Lindbergh baby had been kidnapped. The nation went into shock. Headlines screamed across newspapers. Neighbors whispered in fear. The crime of the century had begun. Little did anyone know, this tragedy would spiral into one of the most controversial trials in American history. A trial that would end with the execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, but leave generations questioning, did justice prevail? Or was an innocent man sacrificed to satisfy a desperate nation? Stay with us as we unravel this mystery, step by step, through the evidence, the trial, and the haunting doubts that remain. As word of the kidnapping spread, the Lindbergh estate was swarmed by police, reporters, and neighbors. The ransom note left on the windowsill was written in broken English, with strange symbols and poor spelling, demanding $50,000 for the safe return of the child. Colonel Lindbergh, desperate to save his son, immediately vowed to pay. Soon, more ransom notes followed, each escalating the threat. The kidnapper warned against police interference and promised the baby would be safe if instructions were followed. Meanwhile, America watched in horror. Radio stations broadcast every update. Newspapers ran extra editions. This was no ordinary crime, it was a national obsession. Then, a man named Dr. John Condon, a retired school principal from the Bronx, offered his services as a go-between. Astonishingly, the kidnappers agreed. Condon became Jaffe, the negotiator. He met a mysterious figure in a cemetery, a man with a thick German accent, who claimed to represent the kidnappers. The ransom was eventually raised to $70,000, paid in gold certificates for easier tracking. Yet, despite the payment, the nightmare was far from over. On May 12, 1932, 2 months after the kidnapping, a truck driver walking near Hopewell, New Jersey, made a horrifying discovery in the woods, just 4 miles from the Lindbergh home. There, partially buried, lay the decomposed body of a child. His skull showed a fatal blow. His clothing matched that of Charles Lindbergh Jr. The child was dead. America wept. The fairytale family had been destroyed. Sympathy for the Lindberghs poured in from across the world. But now, grief turned to rage. The search shifted, from finding the child to finding the killer. But the case had gone cold. The ransom had been paid, the baby was gone, and there were no clear suspects. The investigation stalled, until 2 years later, when fate intervened. When the ransom was paid, investigators had been clever. They recorded the serial numbers on the gold certificates, knowing they could one day resurface. For years, those bills circulated quietly, waiting for a slip. Then, in 1934, a bank teller in New York noticed something strange. A man had used one of the ransom bills to pay for gasoline. Suspicious, the teller checked the serial number. It matched the Lindbergh ransom list. The license plate of the car was written down. It traced back to one man, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant, carpenter, and father. Police rushed to his home. In his garage, hidden in a can, they found $14,000 of the ransom money. Hauptmann was arrested. The nation had its suspect. But was it the truth, or simply a man caught in a web of circumstance? Bruno Hauptmann was a 34-year-old immigrant who had fled Germany after serving in World War I. He worked as a carpenter in the Bronx, lived with his wife Anna, and had no criminal record in America. Yet, when police searched his home, the evidence looked damning. Besides the hidden ransom bills, investigators claimed the wooden ladder found at the Lindbergh estate was built using wood that matched Hauptmann's workshop tools. Neighbors said they noticed he was suddenly flush with money, even after losing his job. He bought a new car, treated himself to luxuries, and still had large amounts of cash at home. To the police, it was an open and shut case. To the public, justice was finally in sight. But Hauptmann swore he was innocent. He claimed he had unknowingly received the money from a business partner who had since died. He insisted he had no part in the kidnapping. Still, the weight of national anger fell on him. The crime of the century demanded a resolution. Hauptmann was put on trial for his life. In January 1935, the trial of Bruno Hauptmann began in Flemington, New Jersey. It was a circus from the start. Thousands of spectators swarmed the courthouse. Journalists from around the world crowded into the small town. Vendors sold hot dogs and souvenirs outside, as though it were a festival. Inside, the stakes were deadly serious. Hauptmann faced charges of murder and kidnapping. If convicted, the electric chair awaited him. The prosecution laid out its case: the ransom bills in his garage, the ladder that matched his tools, handwriting experts who claimed his writing matched the ransom notes, and witnesses who swore they had seen him spending ransom money. The defense fought back, arguing the evidence was circumstantial, the handwriting analysis unreliable, and the witnesses pressured by the frenzy of the case. But in the shadow of the Lindbergh's grief, could any jury see clearly? The presence of Charles and Bruno Lindbergh in the courtroom was devastating. To the jury, to the press, to the public, the sight of the grieving parents spoke louder than any piece of evidence. Colonel Lindbergh testified that he had heard the suspect's voice during ransom negotiations and believed it matched Hauptmann's. The power of a national hero pointing to the accused was overwhelming. And Lindbergh, quiet and pale, embodied tragedy. Every time she entered the courtroom, the jury was reminded not just of a crime, but of a baby, a family destroyed, and the nation's broken heart. The trial was no longer just about guilt, it was about closure, about punishing someone for a crime too monstrous to go unanswered. Hauptmann's defense attorney, Edward Riley, tried to poke holes in the case. He argued that the police had mishandled evidence, that the ladder could have been made by anyone, that the handwriting experts were inconsistent. He pointed out that not a single fingerprint of Hauptmann's was found on the ransom notes, the ladder, or anywhere near the Lindbergh nursery. But the tide was against him. The press painted Hauptmann as a monster. Editorial cartoons showed him as a vulture. Witnesses were paraded before the jury, some shaky, some uncertain, but all reinforcing guilt. It didn't help that Hauptmann, nervous and rigid, came across as cold and unfeeling. To a jury hungry for justice, he seemed the perfect villain. On February 13, 1935, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent. Guilty, they declared. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was convicted of first-degree murder. The penalty, death in the electric chair. The room erupted, some in cheers, others in disbelief. Hauptmann remained stoic, insisting once again that he was innocent, that he had been framed, that the real kidnappers were still out there. But the machinery of justice was already in motion. Appeals were filed, but denied. Clemency was requested, but Governor Harold Hoffman, under immense public pressure, refused to intervene. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Hauptmann walked his final steps into the death chamber at Trenton State Prison. Reporters waited outside. Crowds gathered, some demanding justice, others praying for mercy. At 8:47 p.m., the switch was thrown. Hauptmann was dead. He went to the chair proclaiming his innocence, saying, "I am innocent of all these charges." His wife Anna, loyal until the end, never stopped fighting to clear his name. The nation breathed a sigh of relief. The monster had been punished, the Lindberghs avenged. But in the shadows, doubts lingered. Had justice truly been served? Or had grief, rage, and the need for closure condemned the wrong man? In the next chapters, we'll dive deep into the unanswered questions, the controversies, and the theories that haunt this case to this day. The execution of Bruno Hauptmann should have closed the case. But almost immediately, cracks began to appear. Critics asked, why was there no fingerprint evidence linking Hauptmann to the crime? Why did none of his prints appear on the ladder, ransom notes, or in the nursery? Why did police ignore other suspicious leads once Hauptmann was arrested? Even Governor Harold Hoffman, who had refused clemency, later admitted he was troubled by the trial. He publicly questioned whether the evidence had been enough to justify execution. And the greatest voice of doubt came from Anna Hauptmann, Bruno's widow. For decades, she insisted her husband was innocent, traveling the country, giving interviews, and filing appeals to clear his name. But if Hauptmann wasn't guilty, then who was? One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the homemade wooden ladder found outside the Lindbergh home. Experts testified that the wood matched lumber in Hauptmann's attic, cut with tools from his workshop. But later investigations revealed problems. The wood samples weren't stored properly, raising questions of contamination. The ladder design was crude, unlike Hauptmann's reputation as a skilled carpenter. Some experts argued he never would have built such a flimsy, unsafe structure. Even stranger, witnesses claimed they saw unfamiliar vehicles and men near the Lindbergh estate on the night of the kidnapping, men never connected to Hauptmann. Was the latter really proof of his guilt, or a convenient link crafted by police desperate for a conviction? The most damning evidence against Hauptmann was the $14,000 in ransom money found in his garage. But his defense argued it wasn't proof of kidnapping. Hauptmann claimed he had received the money from a business partner named Isidor Fish, who had since died. Fish, he said, gave him a showbox of belongings before returning to Germany, never revealing what it contained. Skeptics dismissed this as a fabricated excuse. But those who investigated later discovered Fish had indeed been known for shady dealings and had left debts behind. Could he have been part of the crime, and Hauptmann merely unlucky enough to be left holding the money? The truth of the money trail remains murky, one of the great unanswered questions of the case. Another pillar of the prosecution's case was handwriting analysis. Experts claimed the ransom notes matched Hauptmann's writing style. But handwriting analysis in the 1930s was far from reliable. Several modern experts argue the analysis was flawed, even biased. Some suggest police pressured the experts to find a match, while ignoring differences in style, spelling, and formation. Adding fuel to the fire, witnesses testified that police had shown them handwriting samples before they testified, shaping their perceptions. Was the handwriting proof, or prejudice masquerading as science? The Lindbergh case wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. Newspapers called it the trial of the century. Radio stations delivered live updates. Reporters filled the courtroom, hungry for headlines. The media painted Hauptmann as guilty before the trial even began. Editorials labeled him a monster, a foreigner who had destroyed America's golden family. Cartoonists drew him as a vulture, feeding off grief. This frenzy made a fair trial nearly impossible. Jurors, constantly exposed to sensational coverage, were swept into the storm. The question remains, was Hauptmann convicted by evidence, or by public opinion? If not Hauptmann, then who? Over the years, several alternative suspects and theories emerged. Isidor Fish, Hauptmann's former partner, who fled to Germany and left behind the money. Did he mastermind the plot, leaving Hauptmann to take the fall? Inside job theory. Some believed the crime required knowledge of the Lindbergh household. Was it a servant, a worker, or someone close to the family? Mob connections. Rumors swirled that organized crime figures were involved, especially given the ransom negotiations with Jaffe in the Bronx. John Knoll. In later decades, suspicions arose about Knoll, a deli worker with ties to German immigrants, whose accent reportedly matched the cemetery man. Each theory had holes, but each kept the case alive, fueling endless speculation. Throughout the years of doubt and speculation, one voice rarely spoke out: Charles Lindbergh himself. After the trial, Lindbergh and his family left America, moving to Europe to escape the media circus. Lindbergh supported the official verdict and never publicly questioned Hauptmann's guilt. Some critics argue his silence reflected a need for closure, whether the case was truly solved or not. Others believe the Lindberghs, overwhelmed by grief, simply couldn't reopen the wound. But the family's quiet acceptance left many feeling that unanswered questions were deliberately buried. As decades passed, the case transformed from tragedy to controversy. Historians, lawyers, and journalists revisited the evidence, uncovering inconsistencies and failures in due process. Many now see Hauptmann's trial as a miscarriage of justice, an example of how public pressure, media frenzy, and grief can overwhelm fairness. Yet others maintain Hauptmann was guilty, pointing to the money in his possession and his inability to provide a convincing explanation. The debate remains bitter and unresolved, dividing experts and fueling endless books, documentaries, and theories. Anna Hauptmann spent the rest of her life fighting to clear her husband's name. She filed appeals, lawsuits, and petitions, insisting Bruno was innocent. She argued the evidence was planted, the witnesses coerced, and the trial unfair. Though she never succeeded in overturning the verdict, her persistence kept the case alive, inspiring new generations to re-examine the facts. Even today, scholars debate, was Hauptmann guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Or was he simply the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time? The answer remains elusive. Nearly a century later, the Lindbergh kidnapping continues to haunt America. The child's tragic death devastated a family, scarred a nation, and changed history, leading to new laws, including the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping a federal crime. But the central question endures: who really killed the Lindbergh baby? Was it Bruno Hauptmann, the immigrant carpenter, guilty as charged? Or was he a scapegoat, sacrificed to satisfy a nation desperate for justice? The truth may never be fully known. What is certain is that the trial left scars, not only on the Lindbergh family, but on America's trust in its justice system. And now we ask you, what do you believe? Was Bruno Hauptmann guilty, or was the real killer never caught? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the mysteries of true crime.